I call on Government Order of the Day number 1.
New Zealand Superannuation and Retirement Income Amendment Bill, second reading.
Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, I move that the New Zealand Superannuation Retirement Income Amendment Bill be now read a second time. First of all, Mr Speaker, I'd like to thank the Chair and the members of FEC for their report. It was good work on what is quite a technical piece of legislation, but it is an important piece of legislation. The New Zealand Super Fund is a large and growing part of the Crown's total balance sheet, and it will continue to grow. At the end of March, the New Zealand Super Fund had over $29 billion in funds under management. And in the last 10 years, this has been a very significant addition of financial management and financial risk to the Crown balance sheet. Over time, along with the other funds, it will become a more and more significant part of the economy. So it was well set up originally by Dr Cullen and the previous Labor government with a very clear governance structure to, in the first place, prevent politicians from being able to exert influence over this now substantial fund, which will grow to a much larger size than $29 billion. And in the second place, in a way that encourages the good governance and management of the fund, and certainly judging by its returns, it has functioned competently. This bill is aimed at administrative improvements, not governance changes, and it should lead to some cost reduction. And for those who are familiar with the financial services sector, they'll know that even small reductions in costs and fees have a big impact over time. So small reductions achieved through this bill will have a big impact in 2030, 2040, 2050, when people who today are only 25 or 30 years old will be in a situation where the government is drawing on that fund to support their retirement. So the bill implements changes in Part 2 of the New Zealand Superannuation and Retirement Income Act. The bill will allow the guardians of New Zealand Super, as the manager and administrator of the fund, to control entities formed for the purpose of holding or managing investments of the fund, described as FIVs, Funding Investment Vehicles. This has been important because there are restrictions in the current legislation that prevent this fund being a majority owner of any particular investment. That has had the effect of preventing it using some pretty well tried and tested fund management instruments. Enabling the guardians to structure and access investments more efficiently should result in better performance for the fund. The guardians will still be prevented from holding or taking substantial controlling interests in any underlying operating entity, whether directly or through the use of an FIV. The bill will not change the investment universe available to the guardians, and that is a pretty critical point. It doesn't remove any restrictions that currently exist on their ability to have a substantial controlling interest, and it simply enables them to use these particular type of investment vehicles. This is consistent with the Guardian's mandate. It's particularly pertinent to their fiduciary duty to maximise return without taking undue risk for the fund as a whole. The bill will also make administrative changes aimed at increasing the efficiency with which the fund's assets are managed. These include giving the Guardians some delegation powers. Importantly, the board will still be responsible for the actions of any delegate acting under the delegation. I'm informed that all the submitters provided useful suggestions and comments. In particular, the Legislative Advisory Committee provided specific recommendations to clarify wording around the bill's validation clause, that's clause 5, validation provisions, and to clarify whether FIVs would be subject to the Official Information Act. The committee decided that FIVs should be excluded from the OIA given investment risks this would pose. However, the committee was comfortable there are sufficient safeguards around this, given that the guardians of the super fund are subject to the OIA. I must say that the transparency of their reporting has meant that, at least in my role as a minister responsible for the guardians, I've had very few OIA requests, and that is as it should be. Every New Zealander needs to be able to see what is happening with a $29 billion fund that will exist for the next 40 or 50 years. The Select Committee was also concerned to ensure that the ability to use FIVs didn't undermine the principles of Section 59, and this is the one that prevents the guardians controlling any entity. The committee was comfortable that the guardians' approach to date has struck an appropriate balance between the need to maintain a balanced portfolio by investing in 100% of some real assets such as farms and forests, and the requirement not to control entities. This is particularly relevant in the New Zealand situation, where a $29 billion fund can pretty quickly own a significant proportion of the assets available for them to invest in. And as the fund grows from 29 billion to, who knows, 39, 49, 59 billion, there's even more of a challenge in a small economy such as ours. The committee wanted to ensure that the guardians maintain this balance in the future, so they inserted new clauses providing that the Minister of Finance could approve FIV investments or classes of investments that go beyond passive holding of financial products. The way the fund is organised to manage the significant risk it's taking on is critical. In recent years, the fund has made high returns. They can only make such high returns by taking fairly significant investment risk. This means inevitably they will also sometimes make negative returns. I think this is an important point. In the shorter term, the fund has been a stellar performer, returning over 20% on its funds under management. But in the long run, it's very difficult to beat the market average returns, which these days are much lower than 20%. And sometime, no matter how competent and professional this fund is, it is likely to make negative returns. So I'm intending here that to introduce an SOP to the committee at the whole of the stage bill. As I said in the bill's first reading, the biggest risk to the taxpayer around this fund is politicians getting involved in overriding the legislation and interfering with the management of the fund. And I appreciate there's a balance of views here, and it's a bit of a fine line. However, in my view, it's not consistent with the Guardian's independence as originally set up by Dr. Cullen in a very thorough manner, and supported, I think, by most of the Parliament at the time, that independence means that the Minister of Finance should not be approving investments or classes of investments. That's why I want to introduce the SOP, which removes the clauses recommended by the Select Committee for ministerial approval over investment decisions. I agree with the Select Committee the Guardians have struck the right balance, and I believe it is the Guardian's ongoing role to ensure that that balance continues, not the role of ministers. I want to acknowledge and thank the committee and the submitters for the time and effort that they put into that particular issue, because it's a complex one. I'm comfortable that the controls in the Act and the bill ensure that the Guardians will not use the FIVs to expand the scope of what they can and do invest in. These controls include that the bill limits the use of FIVs consistent with the fund's existing mandate, the requirements for the Guardian's statement of investment policy, standards and procedures to include the governance framework for the implementation and operation of the FIVs. If this fund were to show that it could not find that balance, remaining independent, then I'm sure the government would want to see legislative action taken. But it's certainly my experience as the current custodian of the Crown balance sheet of $250 billion that it's best to have these assets managed by people who know what they're doing with clear parameters framed by the government, rather than have the Minister of Finance involved in complex investment decisions, which, speaking only for myself, others more competent in these, at least this Minister of Finance wouldn't know what he was doing. And it's best to leave those decisions to the guardians of the fund. Thanks.
Members, the question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.